Black man moves into a peaceful neighborhood. But when his new neighbor calls the cops on him, things take a surprising turn. The officers arrive, only to realize the man they're about to question is the new police chief. How does the neighborhood react when they find out the truth? Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when James Walker arrived at his new home, a quiet house tucked away in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. The kind of place where neighbors waved to each other from their porches and kids rode their bikes down the street. James had just moved in. He was feeling good about the fresh start. He had been appointed the new police chief of the town just 2 weeks earlier, and this was his new neighborhood, the place where he hoped to build a future for himself. James, dressed neatly in a casual button-up shirt and khakis, stepped out of his car with a small smile. He had spent most of the day unpacking and setting up his new life. It wasn't a grand house by any means, but it was his, and it felt like the beginning of something important. As he made his way up the driveway, a figure watched from across the street. Mrs. Thompson, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, stood by her window, eyeing James carefully. She had seen him pull up earlier and thought something looked a bit out of place. She didn't recognize him, and he didn't look like anyone she had seen before in the neighborhood. To her, James didn't fit the image of what a typical neighbor should look like. She didn't know him, but it didn't matter. In her mind, something about him didn't feel right. Maybe it was the color of his skin, or maybe it was because he didn't seem to belong to the established circle of the community. Whatever the reason, Mrs. Thompson made a quick decision, one that would change everything. Without thinking twice, she picked up her phone and dialed the police. Her fingers trembled slightly as she spoke, her voice tight with suspicion. "I think there's a man here, walking around my street. I don't know what he's doing, but it doesn't seem right. I've never seen him before. He's black, and he's acting strange. I think you should send someone to check him out." Mrs. Thompson's voice carried the quiet weight of judgment, and she didn't even consider the possibility that she could be wrong. After all, she had seen enough to make up her mind. Something was off, and she wasn't about to ignore it. Meanwhile, James was unloading a few more boxes into his house, unaware that the call had been made. He had no idea that, just across the street, a person was making an assumption about him based purely on his appearance. It wasn't until the sirens came into earshot that he began to notice something was amiss. James stood still for a moment, his hand frozen on the handle of a box. It wasn't unusual for the police to patrol the area now and then, but this felt different. The sirens grew louder and then stopped abruptly in front of his house. James turned to face the 2 patrol cars that had pulled up in front of his driveway. He watched as 2 officers stepped out, looking slightly unsure. One officer, a young man in his late 20s, glanced at James, who stood there calmly, box in hand, like he was just another homeowner going about his day. "Can we help you, sir?" the officer asked, his tone polite but guarded. James set the box down and smiled, trying to stay calm despite the unexpected encounter. "Actually, I'm the new police chief in town," he said, his voice steady. "I just moved in a couple of hours ago. Is there a problem?" The officers froze for a split second, clearly caught off guard. This wasn't the answer they had expected. The younger officer exchanged a quick glance with his partner, a middle-aged man who had been with the department for years. Neither of them seemed to know how to respond. James, sensing their confusion, explained further. "I was just unpacking when I heard the sirens. I don't know if this is about me, but I wanted to clear things up." He wasn't angry, nor was he upset. He simply wanted to resolve whatever misunderstanding had been caused. But the officers still didn't seem to fully believe him. Something about the situation didn't sit right with them, especially after Mrs. Thompson's call. They looked at each other again, unsure what to do next. One of the officers walked back to his patrol car and radioed in for confirmation. James stood there, waiting. The officers were quiet, the air thick with tension. It felt like an eternity, though only a few seconds passed. Finally, the officer returned to James, holding up his radio. "We've confirmed. the officer said, sounding both surprised and embarrassed. "You really are the new police chief." The silence that followed was heavy. The younger officer's face turned a shade of red, clearly realizing that he had been called to the scene based on a completely false assumption. He cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to mask his discomfort. The older officer, however, just looked at James, trying to figure out what to say. What could they possibly say to someone who had just been wrongly accused because of their race? But the worst part was yet to come. Mrs. Thompson, the very person who had called the police in the first place, had been watching the entire scene unfold from her window. She had seen the officers pull up, seen James speak with them, and now she was standing there, frozen, realizing what she had done. The moment of truth hit her harder than she expected. She had made a decision based on a stereotype, and it had backfired in the most unexpected way. James, noticing her hesitance, took a deep breath. He wasn't angry at her. Instead, he saw an opportunity to do something bigger, to make a point without saying a word. It was a moment that would change the dynamic of the entire neighborhood. The situation was uncomfortable, yes, but it had the potential to open people's eyes in a way they hadn't been opened before. He knew it was important to show grace, especially when someone else's mistake was rooted in ignorance. The officers, awkwardly shuffling their feet, seemed ready to leave, but James spoke before they could go. "Just one more thing," he said calmly, looking at the officers, then turning his attention to Mrs. Thompson. "I think we all could use a reminder about the consequences of jumping to conclusions. I'm the police chief, but I'm also just a man, like anyone else. I hope this is a lesson we all take with us, because this could have ended differently." The scene left everyone in an uncomfortable silence, but it was just the beginning of something much larger. As the officers drove off, Mrs. Thompson stood there, still processing what had just happened. She had called the police, assuming she was doing the right thing, only to find out that the person she had accused was the very person now in charge of the law enforcement in her town. Her face was pale, her mouth dry, and for the first time in a long while, she was speechless. James, on the other hand, remained calm, composed, and surprisingly patient. He understood what had just transpired, and although he could have reacted with anger or frustration, he chose a different path. He wasn't going to let this situation go unresolved, not just for his own sake, but for the whole community. Within minutes, Mrs. Thompson approached him hesitantly. Her footsteps were slow, and her hands wrung together nervously as if she didn't know what to say. She came closer, the words barely escaping her lips. I didn't know who you were," she muttered, her voice shaky. "I'm so sorry. I made a mistake." James could see the genuine remorse in her eyes, but that didn't make her actions any less damaging. This wasn't just a case of an accidental misunderstanding. It was the result of deep-rooted assumptions and prejudices that ran through the very fabric of the neighborhood. She had made an assumption about him simply because of the color of his skin. He smiled softly, shaking his head, trying to make her feel at ease. "It's okay," he said, his tone calm but firm. "But you need to understand how harmful it is to jump to conclusions based on appearance. That kind of thinking doesn't help anyone." At that moment, Mrs. Thompson stood there, realizing just how wrong she had been. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, and she could no longer ignore the fact that her behavior was rooted in something much deeper than just one phone call. The problem was bigger than her misunderstanding. It was about how people in her community viewed others based on skin color, background, and assumptions. James knew that this was a pivotal moment, not just for him, but for the entire neighborhood. It was a lesson that needed to be learned, but it wasn't going to happen overnight. The damage had already been done, but perhaps, with time, things could be different. He didn't want this to be a one-time conversation. He wanted it to be the start of something bigger, something that would challenge the way people viewed one another and force them to confront their biases. The awkwardness of the situation lingered, but instead of dwelling on it, James decided to take action. "Listen, Mrs. Thompson," he continued, his voice steady but purposeful. I'm not just the new guy here, I'm the police chief. And while I've got a lot of work to do, I think it's important for us to talk about things like this, to address these kinds of issues openly and honestly." Mrs. Thompson nodded, still trying to find the right words. "I know I've got a lot to learn," she said quietly, her face reddening. I didn't think. I just saw you and, well, I assumed." James held up his hand to stop her. "That's the problem," he said gently. "People assume. They see something or someone they don't understand, and they let their fears take over. But that's not how we build a community. That's how we tear it apart." It was clear that Mrs. Thompson had heard his words, but whether she fully understood them was something that would take time. James wasn't expecting an immediate change in her perspective. He knew that deep-seated biases didn't disappear with one conversation. But this conversation was a start, and sometimes that's all it takes to begin shifting the mindset of a community. As the evening wore on, James took a moment to reflect. This moment, awkward as it was, had exposed something that needed to be addressed. It was a problem that was much bigger than one phone call or one incident. It was a problem that ran deep in many parts of society, especially in small communities where people often lived in their own isolated bubbles, unaware of how their actions affected others. And in that moment, James made a decision. This wouldn't be the last time he addressed issues like this in his new neighborhood. He couldn't change everything overnight, but he could start conversations, open doors, and try to make a real difference. And maybe, just maybe, others would start to see things differently too. But before any of that could happen, he had to confront this issue head-on and ensure that everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. James took a deep breath and looked back at the house he was about to call home. He had a feeling that, for all the challenges ahead, this was just the beginning of something much more important than he ever anticipated. The next day, James found himself standing outside his new home, preparing for something he hadn't expected, a community meeting. It wasn't his idea at first, but after the incident with Mrs. Thompson, he realized he couldn't let things slide. He couldn't let this moment of discomfort fade into nothing. The neighborhood needed to have a real conversation about race, assumptions, and how those things affected everyone, even the people who thought they weren't a part of the problem. So James took matters into his own hands. He reached out to a few local leaders and organized a town hall meeting. He didn't want to be confrontational, but he wanted to make sure people understood the gravity of what had happened. He wasn't just a black man who had been wrongly profiled by his neighbor. He was the police chief, someone who held the power to make real changes in the town. And if his position could spark some serious reflection, then he needed to do what he could to make that happen. Word spread fast. It wasn't long before the neighborhood buzzed with talk of the meeting. Some people were curious, others were skeptical, but everyone was talking. The following week, the town hall was set to take place at the local community center, and James prepared himself for what was sure to be a difficult but necessary conversation. As the day of the meeting approached, James thought back to his first conversation with Mrs. Thompson. He remembered how hesitant she had been, how uncomfortable she looked when she realized her mistake. She had apologized, but he knew that her apology wasn't enough. For someone like her, who had lived with these biases for so long, understanding what went wrong was going to take more than just a few words. It would require a shift in perspective, one that came through education and self-reflection. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. James arrived early to ensure everything was set up. Chairs were arranged in a circle, a chalkboard with a few bullet points was placed at the front, and a projector was ready to display important information about bias, stereotypes, and how they impact people's lives. It was a simple setup, but James was determined to make it count. As the clock ticked closer to 7, people started filtering in. Mrs. Thompson was among the first to arrive, walking in slowly with her head down. She clearly didn't want to be the center of attention, but James noticed that she had a look of determination in her eyes, as if she knew this was an important moment for her own personal growth. The room gradually filled with a mix of familiar faces, neighbors who had lived in the area for years, some of whom James had never spoken to. There were also a few people from the local council and even a few young parents who had just moved to the neighborhood, eager to be part of a more open-minded community. James greeted everyone as they entered, shaking hands and exchanging polite pleasantries. But he could tell that the tension in the room was palpable. No one knew exactly what to expect, and some were undoubtedly uncomfortable with the topic at hand. By 7:05, everyone had taken their seats. James stood at the front, his posture confident but not confrontational. He didn't want to come across as someone who was trying to preach or lecture. Instead, he wanted to have a real, open conversation about something that had affected him personally and could potentially affect the community in much larger ways. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I know this isn't an easy topic to discuss, and it might feel uncomfortable, but that's okay. The important thing is that we're here and we're willing to talk about things that are difficult. Yesterday, some of you might have heard about an incident with one of our neighbors. It wasn't the first time something like this has happened, and I'm sure it won't be the last. But the point is, we need to address it. We need to talk about why these things happen and how we can make sure it doesn't keep happening." James paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. He knew that some people in the room were already defensive. They didn't want to feel like they were being blamed for things that were beyond their control. But this wasn't about pointing fingers. It was about learning and moving forward. "I'm sure many of you have heard about what happened. Mrs. Thompson called the police on me yesterday because she thought I didn't belong in this neighborhood. And I get it. I know she didn't mean any harm, but that's exactly the problem. She didn't know me. She didn't take the time to get to know me before making a judgment. And that judgment wasn't just about me. It was about all of us." James could see that Mrs. Thompson was squirming in her seat. Her face had turned red, but she didn't interrupt. Instead, she sat quietly, listening. "I'm not here to call anyone out," James continued. "But we need to understand that these kinds of assumptions, whether we realize it or not, affect people's lives. They affect real people in real ways. And if we want to build a community where everyone feels safe and respected, we need to start by changing the way we think about each other." He let that last sentence hang in the air for a moment, watching the faces in the room. Some nodded in agreement, while others seemed unsure. But James didn't mind. This was just the beginning of the conversation. He wasn't expecting everyone to agree with him right away, but he was hoping to plant a seed. "We all have biases," James continued. "Some of them are subtle, and some of them are more obvious. But they're there whether we want to admit it or not. And it's not enough to just say, 'I'm not racist.' We need to actively challenge those biases and work to change them. That's how we grow, not just as individuals but as a community." The room was quiet now. People were listening, some reflecting on their own experiences, others thinking about the ways they may have unknowingly judged others. James could tell that the conversation was shifting. People were starting to see the issue from a different perspective, and it felt like a small victory. But he knew this was just the beginning. James wasn't expecting immediate change. He knew that real transformation took time, but he was hopeful. This was a chance to help the people in his new town see each other differently, to help them break down the walls they had built without even realizing it. It was a start, and that's all he needed. A start. As the meeting went on, more people began to speak up, sharing their thoughts and experiences. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was real. And for the first time, James felt like the community was truly beginning to listen. As the discussion continued, the room grew more comfortable with the difficult topic. People who had been quiet at first began to share their own stories. Some about times they had unintentionally held biases, others about how they had felt judged or misunderstood in the past. James listened carefully, not just as a police chief, but as someone who genuinely cared about the people in the room. The more they talked, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about one misunderstanding or one mistake. It was about an entire community learning to see each other differently. One of the first to speak up was Sarah, a young mother who had recently moved to the neighborhood with her 2 kids. "I'll be honest," she began, glancing around the room nervously. "I didn't think this was going to be such a big deal. But when I heard what happened with Mrs. Thompson, I felt uncomfortable. I mean, it made me think, have I ever assumed things about people just because they looked different from me? I don't want to be that person. James nodded in acknowledgement. It's not about being a bad person, he said. Most of us don't realize when we make assumptions. We grow up with certain ideas and sometimes we don't even notice we're acting on them. But that's why we're here, to recognize it, talk about it, and do better. Another voice broke into the conversation. This time it was Rick, an older man who had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 30 years. I've lived here a long time and I've seen a lot of people come and go, he said. I can't say I've never had thoughts like Mrs. Thompson's. I've had my share of judgments too. But this conversation, it's making me think. We can't just keep pretending these things don't exist. The room fell quiet again, and James could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. This was what he had hoped for. Real, honest conversation. It wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. Exactly, James replied. These aren't easy conversations, but we need to have them. We can't just ignore the problem and hope it goes away. We need to challenge ourselves and ask questions. Why do we feel the way we do? Why do we judge others based on things they can't control, like their skin color or where they come from? As he spoke, he could see people starting to think, starting to reflect. Some of the defensiveness from earlier in the meeting had begun to fade, but there was still tension in the air, tension that was slowly turning into understanding. James turned his attention back to Mrs. Thompson, who had been quiet for most of the meeting. She had her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face still red, but there was a new look in her eyes, a mix of guilt and curiosity. She raised her hand, and when James nodded to her, she stood up. I want to say something, she said, her voice shaking. I've been thinking a lot about what's been said tonight, and I know I made a mistake. I don't want to be the kind of person who judges others based on their looks. I grew up with a lot of prejudices, but that doesn't mean I can't change. I just need to learn how. I'm sorry for what I did to you, James. I know it wasn't right. James smiled gently. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, he said. That's the first step. Admitting there's a problem is the hardest part, but you've done that. Now, it's about learning and growing. The room was quiet again, but this time it was a comfortable silence. People were processing, reflecting on what had just happened. Some were even nodding in agreement. For the first time, it felt like there was a shift happening. I'm not asking for anyone to be perfect, James continued, his voice steady. What I am asking is that we all try. We all have work to do. This isn't about pointing fingers or calling anyone out. It's about recognizing that we all have biases we need to confront, whether we want to or not. And once we do that, we can make this neighborhood better, for all of us. A few more people spoke up after that, each sharing their thoughts on the conversation. The talk slowly turned into a more positive, constructive dialogue about how they could all be better neighbors to each other. It wasn't just about the issues of race and prejudice. It was about how they could support one another, challenge old assumptions, and create a more welcoming environment for everyone, regardless of where they came from. James felt a sense of accomplishment as the meeting came to an end. It wasn't the easiest conversation he'd ever had, and it certainly wasn't the last one he would need to lead. But tonight, something had changed. People were listening, thinking, and most importantly, engaging with each other in a way they hadn't before. As people began to leave the meeting, James made sure to thank them for their openness and participation. He had no illusions that everything was solved in one night, but he knew this was a start. They had planted a seed, and now it was time for that seed to grow. But before the last person left, Sarah came up to him, a thoughtful look on her face. You know, I've lived here for years, and I never realized how much I didn't understand about these issues. I've been avoiding the uncomfortable conversations, hoping they would just go away. But now I see that avoiding it doesn't help anyone. I want to do more. How can I help? James smiled, genuinely proud of her. Just keep having these conversations, he said. Talk to your neighbors, talk to your kids, keep asking questions. The more we talk, the less we let fear and misunderstanding drive our decisions. As Sarah walked out, James couldn't help but feel hopeful. It had been a challenging day, but it had also been a turning point. Maybe, just maybe, this neighborhood was on its way to becoming a place where people didn't just see each other for what they looked like, but for who they really were. As the last few neighbors trickled out of the community center, James stood by the door, shaking hands and offering his thanks. There was a new energy in the air, something he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the usual small talk and polite smiles. People were engaged, they were asking questions, and they were determined to do better. They had started a conversation, and now they wanted to keep it going. James had no illusions that everything would change overnight. There were still deep-rooted prejudices to overcome, and the journey toward a more open-minded community was going to take time. But as he watched people leave with new thoughts in their minds, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was just the beginning. The next morning, as James sat down at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, he knew that the work wasn't over. He had made the first step, but there was so much more to do. And the best way to keep the momentum going was to engage even more people in the conversation. He pulled out his phone and drafted a quick message to the neighborhood email list. "Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming to last night's meeting. It was a powerful conversation, and I believe we've taken a big step forward together. But this is just the start. If you weren't able to make it, I encourage you to reach out. Let's keep talking, keep learning, and keep growing together as a community. If you have questions or thoughts you want to share, don't hesitate to get in touch. We're all in this together." James hit send, knowing that these kinds of outreach efforts were key to building trust and ensuring the conversation didn't end with one meeting. He also thought about ways to further foster openness in the community. Perhaps hosting smaller, informal gatherings where neighbors could get to know each other better, or organizing activities that encouraged people from different backgrounds to come together. But for now, he focused on the task at hand. There was still work to do, and he wasn't about to let this moment slip away. He knew that the first step was always the hardest, but now that the door had been opened, it was up to everyone to walk through it. James wasn't going to back down, and neither was the community. They had learned something valuable, and it was time to keep that lesson alive. He sent a follow-up reminder to his social media as well. Thanks again to everyone who came out to the meeting. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to our community page and stay updated on future events. Let's continue this conversation, because when we work together, we all win. James knew that getting people to engage wasn't always easy, but if they kept talking and kept pushing the boundaries of their comfort zones, things would change. That was the kind of leadership he wanted to provide, not just enforcing the law, but helping his community grow, evolve, and learn from each other. As he posted the message online, he couldn't help but feel hopeful. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, there would be difficult conversations, and not everyone would be on board. But one thing was clear. This was a community that was willing to change, and James Walker, along with everyone who had joined the conversation, was going to make sure that they did. If we want to make a difference, we have to be part of the solution, James said to himself, closing his laptop. And that starts with the people right here, right now. Over the next few weeks, the impact of that first town hall meeting began to ripple through the neighborhood in ways that no one had expected. While not every resident instantly embraced the changes James had hoped for, something had shifted. People were talking, thinking, and, most importantly, questioning the assumptions they had once taken for granted. James continued to hold meetings, both formal and informal, where neighbors could sit down, share their thoughts, and ask tough questions. Slowly, a sense of understanding started to build between the residents. The community was becoming more aware of the unconscious biases that shaped their interactions, and that awareness sparked real change. Mrs. Thompson, who had been so embarrassed after the incident, became one of the most vocal supporters of James's efforts. She took it upon herself to educate those around her, acknowledging her own mistakes and encouraging others to reflect on their actions as well. It wasn't easy. and not everyone agreed with her newfound perspective, but she stood by her word, knowing that this was a process of growth for everyone, herself included. James, too, began to feel more at home. He wasn't just the police chief anymore. He was a part of the community, someone who had challenged the status quo and opened up a path toward healing. He kept in touch with those who had attended the meeting, offering support and checking in to see how things were going. And while the work was ongoing, he could see that the neighborhood was slowly transforming, one conversation at a time. At a local park a month later, James ran into Sarah, the young mother who had opened up so honestly during the meeting. She was sitting with her children, watching them play on the swings. As he approached, she waved him over. "Hey, James. I just wanted to say thanks again," she said, smiling warmly. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about, and I'm trying to have those conversations with my kids. It's not always easy, but I want them to grow up knowing that it's okay to ask questions and challenge things that don't make sense." James smiled back, genuinely proud of the progress Sarah had made. "You're doing exactly what we need. It's all about starting those conversations and being willing to listen, even when it's uncomfortable." As he left the park that day, James reflected on how far the community had come since that awkward first meeting. There was still work to be done, of course. There would always be challenges. But he knew that if they could keep talking, keep learning, and keep pushing themselves to think differently, they would continue to grow together. The lesson was clear. Change didn't happen overnight, but it started with one decision to face the uncomfortable truths, and to do so with an open mind. Mrs. Thompson, Sarah, and even James himself had taken that step, and together they were building a community where assumptions were questioned, empathy was encouraged, and growth was a shared responsibility. In the end, this story wasn't just about a misunderstanding between a neighbor and a new police chief. It was about how even the most difficult situations can spark meaningful change, as long as people are willing to listen, learn, and do the hard work of creating a better world for everyone. And as James walked back home that evening, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. Hope for a future where people looked at each other with understanding, not judgment. Hope for a neighborhood that was learning, evolving, and, most importantly, standing together in the face of ignorance and prejudice. That, he realized, was the real power of leadership. It wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about inspiring people to be better, to treat each other with respect, and to make their world a more inclusive place for everyone. And for James, that was just the beginning. As weeks passed, the neighborhood began to change in small but significant ways. The conversations that had started in that first meeting spread beyond the walls of the community center. People who had once avoided talking about race, bias, and assumptions were now openly discussing them in their yards, at the local coffee shop, and even at the grocery store. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments of tension, but the openness was growing, and that was what mattered. James often found himself reflecting on how much had shifted since that day with Mrs. Thompson. He remembered how he had stood in front of the group, unsure of how his words would be received. The discomfort, the awkwardness, even the defensiveness of some of the residents. All of that had felt so overwhelming at the time. But now, as he saw neighbors making an effort to connect, to reach out to each other and to learn, he realized that those difficult conversations were exactly what the community needed. It wasn't just about his role as the police chief anymore. It was about being a part of a larger, more inclusive movement that had started right there, in his own neighborhood. He had planted the seed, but it was the people who lived there, his neighbors, who had nourished it and made it grow. One evening, after a long day of meetings and paperwork, James sat on his front porch sipping a cup of tea as the sun began to set. He watched as the street slowly quieted down, with children running home for dinner and neighbors greeting each other from their driveways. It was a peaceful scene, but there was something different now, a sense of unity that hadn't been there before. People were more aware of each other, more willing to lend a hand or offer a kind word. That night, Mrs. Thompson knocked on his door. She had been a regular visitor since the town hall meeting, eager to keep learning and staying involved. She had started attending workshops on diversity, volunteering with local organizations, and even organizing small gatherings to talk about the lessons learned from the community conversations. "James," she said, smiling as she stepped onto the porch, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the meeting. You were right about everything, about how assumptions can hurt people even if we don't mean it. I'm still working on unlearning all those old habits, but I'm getting there." James smiled back, proud of her. "You're doing great, Mrs. Thompson. Change isn't easy, but you've shown a lot of courage. Not just in admitting your mistakes, but in taking responsibility and doing the work to grow." She nodded. "I've realized something. It's not just about me changing. It's about how I can help others understand, too. The more we talk about this stuff, the more we open ourselves up to change. I'm just glad I'm part of it now." "Me too," James said, his voice warm with appreciation. "The real power of this community isn't in the rules we enforce or the laws we pass. It's in the way we support each other, the way we listen, and the way we challenge ourselves to be better. You're an example of that." As the evening went on, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road to true understanding was long, and the challenges were far from over. But the community had made a real commitment to change. People weren't just agreeing with each other. They were evolving, growing, and rethinking their assumptions. That night, James sat on his porch for a while longer, feeling more connected to his neighborhood than ever before. He had faced the uncomfortable reality of prejudice and bias head-on, but more importantly, he had opened the door for others to do the same. And while it wasn't a perfect world, it was a world where people were willing to try. That was enough for now. Tomorrow he'd continue his work, leading, learning, and pushing for the kind of change that started with one conversation and grew into something far bigger than any of them had imagined. But tonight, he allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. It was the peace of knowing that together, they were all on the path to something better. As the stars began to twinkle above, James couldn't help but smile. The journey was just beginning, and he was proud to be part of it. As months went by, the small suburban neighborhood began to see the ripple effects of the conversations that had started with that one pivotal meeting. It wasn't just a fleeting moment or a one-time event. It was the beginning of a transformation that would have a lasting impact. People who had never spoken to each other before were now exchanging stories, sharing their experiences, and, most importantly, challenging their preconceived notions about race, identity, and what it meant to truly be a community. One evening, James attended a neighborhood barbecue organized by a group of residents who had become more involved in these open conversations. He had received a few invites over the past couple of months, and this one was special. This time, the conversation wasn't just about food and fun. It was about the progress the neighborhood had made and the work still ahead. As he walked into the backyard, he was greeted by familiar faces. Sarah, who had continued her efforts to engage with her children about bias, waved him over with a smile. "Hey, James. Glad you could make it. We've got some of our newer neighbors here tonight, and I've been telling them about the town hall meetings and how things have changed since then." James smiled back. "I'm glad to hear that. The more we talk, the more it sticks, right?" Sarah nodded, her eyes lighting up. "Exactly. I've seen so many of our neighbors start to open up in ways I didn't expect. Even Rick, who's usually quiet, has been getting involved in some of the discussions. And Mrs. Thompson, she's really taken to heart what we talked about at the meeting. I think she's going to try organizing a book club about racial justice next month." James couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had seen Sarah grow over the past few months, becoming a voice for understanding and change in the neighborhood. To hear that she was actively taking the initiative to include others, including Rick, a neighbor who had once been more hesitant, was a sign that the conversation was expanding, reaching deeper into the community. As the evening wore on, more people joined in, and James found himself surrounded by a group of residents eager to talk. There were discussions about how to foster more inclusive events, how to address uncomfortable topics without fear, and how to create spaces where everyone felt heard. People from different walks of life, with different perspectives and experiences, were sharing openly and honestly. One conversation in particular stuck with James. He overheard a group of neighbors, some older, some younger, talking about how the neighborhood had changed in recent months. "I've noticed more of us are speaking up now," one woman said. "People are less afraid to confront the things we've been avoiding for so long." "Yeah," another neighbor added. "Before, it was like everyone just went about their lives without really talking to each other. But now it feels like we're a real community, like we're actually seeing each other." James listened quietly, taking it all in. He had hoped for moments like this, moments when people didn't just go through the motions of community life but truly engaged with one another. It wasn't just about neighbors being friendly. It was about neighbors being present in each other's lives, understanding each other and supporting each other in meaningful ways. He looked over at Mrs. Thompson, who was deep in conversation with a group of younger parents. She was laughing, her face more relaxed than it had been when James first met her. It was clear that she had become an advocate for the changes she had once resisted. She had transformed from someone who had made an unconscious, hurtful judgment to someone who was actively working to correct it. James walked over to her, offering a friendly smile. "Looks like you're having a good time," he said. Mrs. Thompson looked up, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I am. I'm actually organizing a potluck next month where we can all bring dishes from different cultures. It's about learning from each other, sharing what we know, and celebrating who we are. You know, I never thought I'd be saying this, but I think I've been missing out on a lot." James chuckled. "Well, I'm glad to see the change. It's amazing to witness." "It is," she agreed. "And you're right, James. It starts with us, with these small conversations, these moments where we make an effort to understand. I've realized that when we stay in our bubbles, we miss out on so much." "I couldn't agree more," James said, his heart swelling with pride. "That's exactly what we're doing here, breaking down those walls and making sure we're not just living next to each other, but with each other." As the night came to a close, James found himself reflecting on everything that had happened since that first awkward encounter with Mrs. Thompson. He had faced the challenge of prejudice head-on, and though it hadn't been easy, he had helped spark a movement in the neighborhood, a movement of change, understanding, and, most importantly, connection. In the end, the real change wasn't just about challenging individual biases. It was about creating a community where people didn't just tolerate each other's differences, but celebrated them. It was about forging bonds that went beyond the superficial, and reaching a place where real growth and understanding could happen. As James drove home that evening, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The neighborhood he had moved into months ago had become something more. It had become a place where people looked beyond the surface, where they saw each other for who they truly were, and where they were building a future together, one conversation at a time. And for James, that was the kind of community he had always hoped for. Despite the progress, James knew that the road to a truly unified community was never going to be smooth. It wasn't just about having a few good conversations or holding a couple of town meetings. Real change would be tested by time, by new challenges, and by the difficult, messy parts of human nature that didn't always want to budge. And just when things seemed to be moving in the right direction, the neighborhood faced an unexpected setback. It started with a small disagreement at a neighborhood meeting. A couple of newer residents, people who had moved into the area after James, expressed concerns about some of the changes they were seeing. They felt uncomfortable with how openly the community was now discussing race and bias. One resident, a man named Greg, a father of 3 young children, raised his hand and said, "I just don't understand why we have to talk about this all the time. I'm all for getting along, but I'm not sure this is the right way to go about it. We don't need to make everything about race. Can't we just go back to how things used to be? We didn't have problems before." The room went silent. James could feel the tension rise immediately. Sarah, who had been so vocal and supportive of the new direction the community was taking, was visibly upset by his comment. Others in the room shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. Greg's comment wasn't an isolated sentiment. James knew that some people in the neighborhood still had reservations about addressing these issues head-on. For them, the conversations about race felt like a threat to the harmony they thought existed. The tension between wanting to acknowledge the problems and not wanting to make waves was a delicate balance, and it was starting to feel like the cracks were showing. James, who had grown more comfortable in his leadership role, realized that it was in moments like this, moments of discomfort and pushback, that the true test of community would come. It wasn't about avoiding the hard conversations or shying away from conflict. It was about creating a space where those who were struggling to understand could feel heard, while also reinforcing the importance of the work that still needed to be done. He raised his hand, asking for the room's attention. "I understand where you're coming from, Greg," James began, his voice calm and measured. "It can be exhausting to talk about these issues all the time. I'm sure it feels like we're opening up wounds that we don't want to deal with. But what I want to emphasize is that these conversations aren't just about focusing on problems. They're about creating solutions. They're about ensuring that everyone, no matter their background, feels welcome and safe here." There was a slight pause, and Greg looked skeptical but didn't interrupt. "I know it's uncomfortable," James continued, "and I know it's not easy to change the way we think, the way we act. But the truth is, if we avoid these conversations, if we ignore the issues at hand, we risk falling back into the same patterns of misunderstanding and division that we've seen for generations. We don't need to go backwards. We need to move forward. Together." The room remained quiet for a long moment. Some people nodded, others exchanged uncertain glances, but James could tell that the message had landed. This wasn't the first time he'd seen resistance to change in his career as a police chief, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But this time, he wasn't alone. The foundation of understanding and compassion the neighborhood had built over the past few months was still strong. It was fragile, yes, but it was there. Greg, after a long silence, finally spoke. "I guess I never thought about it that way," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Maybe I've been a little too focused on what feels comfortable, rather than what's right." James nodded, his expression softening. It's easy to stay in the comfortable zone, especially when it feels like you're not part of the problem. But growth happens when we challenge that comfort. And it's not about making anyone feel bad. It's about making sure no one gets left behind. The rest of the meeting went more smoothly after that. People who had been hesitant began to speak up more, asking questions and sharing their concerns in a more constructive way. Greg's comment, while difficult to hear, had opened the door to an even deeper conversation. A conversation about how to keep moving forward when the path seemed uncertain. As the meeting ended, James couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Yes, there had been pushback. And yes, it hadn't been easy. But they had worked through it. They had shown that even when things got uncomfortable, they could talk, listen, and find common ground. That was the foundation of the community James had been hoping for. A community that didn't just tolerate differences but embraced them, even when it was tough. Walking home that evening, James reflected on the complexity of leadership and community building. The easy moments were behind him. The hard work was just beginning. He knew that the road ahead would continue to be challenging, with new obstacles to face and old assumptions to break down. But that was the price of progress. And he was ready for whatever came next. The days following the heated neighborhood meeting were filled with a mixture of uncertainty and quiet determination. James could feel the shift in the atmosphere. While some people were motivated by the conversations, there were still a few who remained skeptical, including Greg, who had voiced his discomfort the night of the meeting. He seemed distant the following days, avoiding eye contact with James and others who had been part of the discussion. It wasn't just the discomfort of the meeting that lingered. It was the doubt about whether the efforts to create real change could overcome years of ingrained habits and attitudes. James had always believed that change took time. It wasn't going to happen overnight, especially when deeply held beliefs were involved. But seeing people like Greg, who had shown signs of hesitation, made him wonder how many others were silently resisting the movement for change. He had spent months trying to foster understanding, build relationships, and challenge prejudices, but now he was faced with the reality that not everyone was on board. Despite the setbacks, James refused to let the doubt win. He knew that true leadership wasn't about making everyone agree with him. It was about guiding the community through discomfort, challenging them to think differently, and continuing the dialogue even when it felt like they were moving in circles. So, instead of retreating from the uncomfortable silence, James decided to reach out directly to Greg. One afternoon, as he was finishing up paperwork in his office, James decided to take the initiative. He knew that in moments of doubt it was easy to isolate oneself or to avoid the hard conversations. But if the community was to grow stronger, those conversations needed to continue, even if they were difficult. He grabbed his coat and walked over to Greg's house. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. And as James walked down the street, he couldn't help but reflect on how much had already changed in such a short period of time. Still, he knew that Greg, and others like him, needed reassurance that the effort was worth it, that the uncomfortable moments were leading somewhere important. When he knocked on Greg's door, it was Greg's wife Karen who answered. She smiled politely but gave James a curious glance. "Hey, James, what can I do for you?" she asked. "Hi, Karen. Is Greg home?" James asked, his voice friendly but purposeful. "Yeah, he's in the garage. Let me get him for you," she said, stepping aside. Greg appeared a moment later, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked surprised to see James but waved him in. "Hey, James. Didn't expect to see you today. What's up?" "I just wanted to check in," James replied. "After the meeting the other night, I've been thinking about our conversation. I know it wasn't easy for everyone, and I wanted to see how you were feeling about things." Greg shifted uncomfortably but didn't avoid the question. "Honestly, I'm still kind of wrestling with it," he admitted. "I get what you're trying to do. I do. But I guess I just don't understand why it feels like the focus is always on race. I mean, we've always gotten along just fine, right? So why make things complicated?" James nodded, understanding Greg's frustration. "It's a valid question. And the truth is, we have gotten along. But the reality is that doesn't mean there aren't problems beneath the surface. Sometimes things that seem fine on the outside can hide deeper issues. And the fact is, not everyone has felt like they truly belong here, Greg. Especially people who've been treated differently their whole lives." Greg didn't immediately respond, but his gaze softened. "I guess I've never had to think about that," he said quietly. "I've lived here my whole life, and I've never been made to feel like I didn't belong." "And that's exactly the point," James replied. "For you, for me, and for many of the people in this neighborhood, things have been smooth. But for others, they've faced challenges we might not see. It's not just about race, it's about how we all perceive each other. How do we make sure everyone feels like they're part of the community, that they matter, no matter where they come from or what they look like?" Greg's expression shifted and he leaned against the workbench in his garage. "I get it now. It's not just about talking for the sake of talking. It's about making sure people aren't left out without us even realizing it." He paused, his voice softer. "I don't know if I've always been the best at seeing that, but I want to try. I really do." James smiled. "And that's what this is all about. It's not about being perfect. It's about being open to learning, even when it feels uncomfortable. The truth is, we all have blind spots. But as long as we're willing to face them and work together, that's how we build something better." Greg nodded slowly. "Thanks for coming over, James. I appreciate you taking the time to talk. I'll keep thinking about everything. It's not easy, but I can see now why it's important." As James left Greg's garage and walked back down the street, he felt a small but significant weight lift off his shoulders. It hadn't been an easy conversation, but it had been an important one. Greg had been hesitant, unsure, and even defensive at first, but by simply having an honest dialogue, they'd taken a step forward. Not just Greg, but the whole neighborhood. James knew that there would always be doubts, and not everyone would come around at the same time. But it was in these moments, when the difficult conversations were had, when people were willing to reflect and question their own assumptions, that real change happened. The path was still long, and there were still plenty of hurdles ahead, but each small victory, each conversation, each challenge faced, was a step closer to building the kind of community they all deserved. And for the first time in a while, James was certain that they were on the right path. As the weeks passed, the changes in the neighborhood were subtle but unmistakable. The conversations about race, bias, and inclusion continued to evolve, growing more nuanced as people grappled with their own views and experiences. Despite the pushback Greg had initially shown, it became clear that the difficult dialogue was working. People were beginning to talk more openly, to reflect on their own actions and attitudes, and most importantly, to listen. Greg, who had seemed distant at first, began to show up at more of the neighborhood gatherings, quietly listening, engaging in discussions, and offering his own perspective. He wasn't yet an outspoken advocate for the changes James was pushing for, but he was learning, and that was a victory in itself. Sarah, too, had seen a shift. She noticed that many of her neighbors were making more of an effort to challenge the assumptions they had carried for years, though it wasn't always easy or comfortable. It was a slow process, but it was progress. However, even as the discussions gained traction, some underlying tensions remained. The discomfort that had surfaced during the earlier town meetings still lingered in some corners. Some residents were quietly skeptical, unsure if these conversations about race were truly necessary, or if they were being forced to confront issues that didn't feel relevant to their daily lives. James understood that change couldn't happen in a vacuum. Trust had to be rebuilt, not just with those who had resisted, but with the entire community. For him, it wasn't enough to talk about the issues. They had to demonstrate their commitment through action. Actions like supporting those who had been marginalized, offering opportunities for people to learn from one another, and continuing to lead by example. So, in the spirit of reinforcing the lessons they were learning, James decided to initiate a community project, a volunteer day where neighbors would work together to help improve the local park, a space that had been neglected for years. It wasn't just about cleaning up litter or repainting benches. It was about bringing people together, making them work side by side toward a common goal, and using that shared experience to strengthen bonds. The event was a success beyond what James could have expected. As people painted fences, cleared debris, and planted flowers together, old barriers seemed to break down. It wasn't a grand gesture, but the simple act of working together on something tangible made a difference. It helped reinforce the idea that when people united, they could create something better, not just for themselves, but for the entire community. In the weeks following the park cleanup, James began to reflect on his own role in the ongoing transformation of the neighborhood. He had always seen leadership as a responsibility, not just a title. But now, in the face of so much change, he realized that leadership was more than guiding people through tough conversations. It was about showing up, demonstrating vulnerability, and being willing to make mistakes and learn from them. James had spent much of his life in law enforcement, where leadership was often defined by authority and control. But this was different. In this neighborhood, leadership wasn't just about telling people what to do. It was about creating a space for everyone to have a voice, to feel heard, and to have a stake in the community's future. The park cleanup had taught him a valuable lesson. It wasn't the speeches or the big meetings that brought people together. It was the quiet moments, the shared work, and the commitment to something bigger than oneself. It was the willingness to take action and show that everyone's contribution mattered. And it was about leading by example, staying humble, staying open to feedback, and remaining patient as the community worked through its challenges. James knew that there would be more tough conversations ahead. There would always be resistance, especially from those who felt like the changes were too fast or too uncomfortable. But he was beginning to see that the real strength of leadership came from the ability to keep moving forward, even when the road seemed uncertain, and from the ability to inspire others to keep going too. As he walked through the park one evening after the cleanup, he paused to look at the freshly painted benches and the kids running across the green space. There was something different in the air, something palpable. People were starting to feel like they truly belonged here, like they were part of something that was bigger than themselves. And in that moment, James realized that this was what he had been working toward all along. Not just a community that tolerated each other, but one that genuinely cared for one another. A place where the differences between people weren't just accepted, but celebrated. And that was the kind of neighborhood James had always dreamed of. As the seasons changed, the neighborhood continued to evolve. The conversations about race, inclusion, and identity were no longer limited to town hall meetings or organized events. They had become part of the everyday fabric of life. People didn't shy away from tough topics anymore. They were willing to confront the uncomfortable truths, challenge each other, and, most importantly, listen and learn. James watched this transformation with a sense of pride, knowing that he had played a role in helping to guide the community toward something better. But he also knew that this was a collective effort. It wasn't just his leadership that had made the difference. It was the willingness of the people around him to embrace change, to be vulnerable, and to show up every day with a commitment to growth. The community wasn't perfect. It still had its flaws, its moments of doubt and tension. But it had come a long way since that first awkward encounter with Mrs. Thompson. People were more connected now, more willing to support one another. They understood that their differences were not a source of division, but a source of strength. One evening, James stood at the front of the community center once again, looking out over the faces of his neighbors. It had been a year since that first meeting, and the neighborhood had grown in ways he had never expected. There was a sense of unity, of shared purpose that hadn't existed before. "We've come a long way," James said, his voice steady and sincere. "And while we've made progress, the work isn't done. But I'm proud of the strides we've made, and I'm grateful to each and every one of you who has shown up, who has been willing to learn, and who has been willing to make this place better for all of us. This isn't just my victory. This is our victory." The applause that followed was genuine, heartfelt. James could feel the pride in the room. He had worked hard to create a space where everyone felt valued, heard, and seen. And though there was still work to be done, the foundation had been laid. As he left the meeting that night, James felt a quiet satisfaction. The neighborhood had become something more than a group of houses on the same street. It had become a community, a place where people didn't just live side by side, but truly cared for each other. And for James, that was the greatest accomplishment of all. Despite the positive changes, James knew that the path forward wouldn't always be clear, and there would still be challenges ahead. As much progress as they had made, there were moments when old habits would creep back in, when assumptions and prejudices would resurface, and when the easy way out, silence or avoidance, would seem tempting. Change was never linear. It wasn't just about creating an environment where people were comfortable, but also one where they could grow, even when it was uncomfortable. One of the biggest hurdles was the long-term commitment to understanding and learning. While the neighborhood had made significant strides, James knew it wasn't enough to simply acknowledge the issues. The real challenge lay in maintaining the momentum, in ensuring that these conversations didn't become just another fleeting trend. He needed to make sure that they weren't just addressing these issues when things went wrong, but that they were proactively working toward deeper inclusivity and awareness every day. There were still some residents like Greg who remained hesitant. They had taken the first steps, but for them, it wasn't always easy to reconcile these new ideas with their old ways of thinking. And there were also others who, while they appreciated the work that had been done, still preferred to avoid discussions that made them feel uncomfortable. James understood that it was part of the process. It was about creating a space where people felt safe enough to confront their discomfort, rather than running from it. For James, that meant continuing to engage. He couldn't force change on anyone, but he could encourage those who were open to it. He could continue to lead by example, having tough conversations and creating opportunities for people to share their experiences and learn from one another. Whether it was a small conversation in the park or another community project, James knew that action was key. The truth was, there would never be a finish line for this kind of work. It wasn't about achieving a final goal. It was about creating a culture that valued growth, empathy, and inclusivity. James realized that his job wasn't to make everyone agree with him. His job was to keep encouraging the difficult conversations, keep facilitating opportunities for connection, and most importantly, keep listening to his neighbors. As the years went by, the changes in the neighborhood became more ingrained. What had once been difficult conversations and uncomfortable silences had slowly transformed into meaningful dialogue and deeper relationships. James watched as the younger generation, children who had been part of the community cleanup projects, those who had attended the town hall meetings, and the kids who grew up hearing stories of their parents' transformation, became the new leaders of the neighborhood. They had learned the lessons of empathy, inclusion, and openness in a way that would serve them for a lifetime. James felt a quiet pride when he saw the children playing together at the park he had helped revitalize. He saw Sarah, once a hesitant mother, now actively teaching her children about the importance of diversity and respect for others. He saw Mrs. Thompson, who had become an active community advocate, organizing programs to teach tolerance and encourage respectful dialogue in local schools. These were the moments James cherished, the small, everyday reminders that the community was stronger, more connected, and more inclusive than it had ever been. Though there would always be more work to do, James knew that the foundation had been built. The neighbors had shown that they could confront uncomfortable truths, question long-held assumptions, and most importantly, move forward together. They had learned that growth didn't come from avoiding difficult issues. It came from embracing them, learning from them, and taking action, even when it was hard. As he stood on his porch one evening, looking out over the neighborhood, James reflected on everything that had led him here. He thought about the day he moved into the neighborhood, when he had been an outsider, just another person arriving in a place where he didn't yet belong. He thought about the tension with Mrs. Thompson, the moment of realization when his identity as the police chief became the catalyst for change. And he thought about the long, challenging journey from there to now, a journey that had taken months, years, and countless conversations to get to. But most of all, James thought about what the neighborhood had become, a place where people didn't just live side by side but stood together, a place where the hard conversations were seen not as threats, but as opportunities for growth. A place where differences weren't feared or ignored, but celebrated. James realized that this was the legacy he had hoped for, not just a neighborhood that was more inclusive, but one that was willing to do the hard work to stay that way. And as the sun set over the streets, casting long shadows over the homes of his neighbors, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger, wiser, and more united than ever. This was only the beginning. And for James, that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.